Hello there, welcome to the latest CMU Insight Lockdown webinar. My name is Chris Cook, I am the founder and managing director of CMU. We are here to help you navigate and understand the music business. We do that in a number of different ways, through our daily bulletin, through our weekly podcast, through our online library of reports and guides, and through our training sessions just like this one. Some of you have been attending all of our lockdown webinars. We really appreciate you supporting us in that way. If you are one of those people who've done all of these sessions, welcome back. But some of you, this will be the first time you've tuned in, so hello to you as well. And just for you, I'm going to very quickly explain how these webinars work. Basically, they're in 3 sections. In a minute, I'm going to talk about one of the big news stories of today, basically what was leading today's CMU Daily Bulletin. Just very quickly, to get everything warmed up. Then we have today's main presentation. Today we're talking about digital licensing, how the deals are structured between Spotify-style streaming services and the music industry, and what happens to all the money. That's the main presentation. That will take up most of the webinar. And then in the final 10 minutes, we'll do a Q&A. So basically answering your questions about today's topic, which leads me to a couple of logistical things to say. Here in the Zoom webinar platform, you'll see there are 2 buttons for interacting with us, the chat button and the questions button. So if you have any technical logistical queries, click on the chat button. My colleague Sam is also online this afternoon and he will try and help you. If you have a question about the topic, which I think is much more likely, then please do try to click the question button, not the chat button, because that just helps us organize the questions better for the Q&A section at the end. Now, you can click that question button at any time. We'll answer them, the questions, at the end of the session, but you can ask the questions as soon as they occur to you. There's an awful lot of you tuned in this afternoon, so we probably won't have time to answer all of your questions in the live Q&A. However, we are producing little Q&A reports to go along with each of our webinars where we answer in writing some of the key questions that have been asked, and we're going to do that for today's session as well. Those of you on the full program, we've nearly finished getting those reports together, so we're going to start sending them out to people based on which webinars they have attended very, very soon. And everybody attending today, we will send you the Q&A report after the event later in the week. So if we don't have a chance to answer all your questions, we will do it there. Talking of resources, don't forget you can always download the slides for our lockdown webinars. So the email you got this morning that had the link to where you reached the webinar also had another link, the resource link, a web page on the CMU Insights website. You need a password, but once you're there, you can download a PDF of the slides that you're going to see. So you can have that to keep. I think that's probably all the logistical stuff I need to say. Oh, I know, it's not. There's a recording of this. We are recording as we speak, and so the email we're going to send you later today, which will have a recap of the links. So if you've lost that email from earlier in the day with the info on how you get the slides, don't worry. We've got an email later today which will have the resources link again, but it will also tell you how you can access the recording. So maybe some of you need to nip off in the middle, or you have some technical issues at your end. Don't worry, you'll be able to watch the recording back on demand for a month after today. So I think that is now all the logistical stuff out of the way. So before we get to the main presentation, let's quickly talk about the top story in today's CMU Daily. It's another COVID-19 story, again more on the live side than the sort of recording copyright side of the music industry. We reported today on a survey done by Reuters in the US, and they asked earlier this month about 4,500 American consumers whether, as soon as sporting and music and other live entertainment events are allowed again by state and national governments, will people rush out to get themselves a bit of live entertainment? Because that's the big unknown, isn't it, for the live industry? Well, I mean, there's lots of big unknowns at the moment for the entire music industry, and especially for the live industry because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the measures introduced by governments around the world to restrict and delay the spread of the virus. Initially, the unknown is how long are those restrictions going to be in place? You know, how many more weeks, or are we talking months? Some people even think potentially years before we get properly back to having full-on gigs, festivals, and then of course in the wider industry, sporting events, cinemas being open, etc. But even once the restrictions start to be lifted, and in some European countries they are now slowly coming out of lockdown, once that starts to happen, will there still be a nervousness amongst consumers, music fans, sports fans about going to large-scale events where lots of people are, given the expectation that there will probably be a second, potentially third wave of this virus in the year ahead? And we don't yet have a vaccine. And so what Reuters did was they spoke to lots of people and said, okay, do you normally go to sporting events? Do you normally go to gigs? Do you normally go to the cinema? Once the restrictions are gone and those events reopen for business, will you attend? And they found that amongst the people who said that they do often go to sporting events or music events, so they're not people who never go to live entertainment, of the people who do routinely go to live entertainment, only about 40% were saying as soon as the restrictions are lifted, we're definitely going back. And another 40% said that they were currently inclined to wait until a vaccine is available for COVID-19, even though science tells us that's probably at least a year, potentially 18 months away. So some sobering reading almost, that even once the formal restrictions are lifted, it could still take quite a long time for the live entertainment industry, certainly at the upper end, the bigger shows, to return to normal, because consumers will be nervous about going. Now, of course, the survey was done. It was 4,500 people, so a relatively small sample. And of course, the survey was done right in the middle, earlier this month, right in the middle of the pandemic, where all the news reporting and the political statements are, in essence, very serious and talking about the sort of the worst case scenario. It may be that once life returns something almost normal, that actually people change their minds about that and they are more willing to go to shows, even though we don't have a vaccine, even though the virus could come back. Anyway, it was an interesting little survey that Reuters did in the US. We talked about it in today's CMU Daily, so if you're a subscriber, check out the bulletin. If not, well, either you can read the story on the website, completemusicupdate.com, or sign up to the bulletin. Actually, you still won't get today's bulletin if you sign up. You'll get tomorrow's bulletin. But you should sign up, and you can also check out the story on the website. Okay, that's the music business news story of the day we wanted to talk about. Now it's time for the main presentation, all about digital licensing. We've actually pre-recorded the presentation again today so that me and Sam can focus on processing your questions as they come in. So don't forget, click the question button if you have a question, not the chat button, at any time, and we'll answer as many as we can in the final 10 minutes, and then any we don't get done within the session, we'll try and put some answers in the Q&A report that will follow in due course. So, time now for the main presentation. So this is the CMU Insights webinar, Streaming Explained, How Digital Licensing Works. Over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to talk you through the deals that have been done between the streaming services on the one side and the music industry on the other. But in order for you to understand those deals, you also need to know a little bit about copyright and a little bit about music licensing. So I'm going to throw in some copyright facts and some basic music licensing stuff as well, and once we've done all of that, we'll explain the deals, and we'll also talk through how all the different people involved in this, the artists, the songwriters, the labels, the publishers, and the streaming services themselves, how the money is shared out, how everybody gets paid. That's the remit for the next 30 minutes, and we're going to do that, as we always do, in 10 easy steps. So let's get going with step number 1, and we're going to begin with the copyright law. Let's get the copyright law out of the way to start with. Step number 1. There are 2 sets of music rights. As far as copyright law is concerned, songs and recordings are 2 separate things. So every time you write a song, you create a copyright. There's a copyright in that song. But crucially, if you then record a version of that song, there is a separate copyright in the recording. And in the music industry, we tend to refer to the first set of rights, the song rights, possibly as the publishing rights, and then the second, recording rights, or sometimes we would talk about master rights. Now, in the same way that copyright law treats songs and recordings separately, so does the music industry. So if we look at the music rights industry, that side of the music business that's involved in copyright as opposed to, say, live performance, we can actually split it into 2. And we have the record industry, made up of record labels and recording artists and the collecting societies that those artists and labels work with, the record industry dealing in recording rights. And then we have the separate music publishing sector, the songwriters, the music publishers, and their collecting societies. If you think about it, streaming services, almost by definition, are streaming recordings of songs. So a streaming service is exploiting both sets of rights, and therefore is going to need to get itself deals from the record industry covering recording rights and the publishing sector covering the song rights. Okay, step 2, another copyright fact. Copyright is all about control. What copyright does is it gives creative people control over the output of their creativity. That's what it's all about. And actually, copyright law is more specific than that. Copyright law says, as a copyright owner, you have certain controls distinct separate controls over whatever it is that you own the copyright in. So for example, there's the reproduction control, the actual copyright. But not only can you control the copying of your work, you can also control the distribution of those copies and the rental of those copies. Then there's the adaptation control, when somebody wants to take your song and change the lyrics, or take your track and remix it. That's something the copyright owner has control over. And then there's the public performance control, controlling the public performance of work, and the communication control, controlling the communication of works to the public, the making available of works to the public. Traditionally that would cover broadcast, and today it would cover some internet delivery as well. So those are the 6 controls of the copyright. In the music industry, it's quite common to group the first 2 together and refer to them as either the reproduction rights or more commonly the mechanical rights. That's a publishing term. It's a term that music publishers use. And when a music publisher talks about the mechanical rights, they simply mean the reproduction and distribution controls in songs at the same time. We also tend to group the 2 at the bottom together and refer to them as either the performing rights or the neighbouring rights. Songwriters and publishers tend to prefer the term performing rights. Labels and artists tend to prefer the term neighbouring rights. It's just 2 different ways of saying the same thing. We're talking about the performance and communication controls combined. Now, these copyright controls are absolutely vital in understanding how copyright makes money. It's because of the controls that we can monetize copyright. The basic principle is this: if a third party wants to make use of your music, if they want to exploit one of those controls, they want to copy the music or distribute it, rent it, adapt it, perform it, communicate it, well, the copyright owner has control over all of those things. So if you're the copyright owner and I want to use your music, I have to come to you for permission, and you sell me that permission, and that's how copyright makes money. And we call this selling of permission licensing. Now, step number 3. When it comes to this licensing process, selling permission to third parties that want to exploit the controls of copyright, the music industry does that in 2 different ways. First of all, there's direct licensing, and secondly, there's collective licensing. Direct licensing in some ways is simpler to get your head around. If you're the user of music and I own the copyright on the song and recording, and you want to make use of my music, well, you come to me and we negotiate a deal. You say, hey Chris, I want to use your music. I say, you can use my music, but subject to certain terms, subject to a certain price. And we agree those terms, we negotiate a deal, and then you get to use my music and I make some money. Or maybe I don't actually negotiate the deal myself. Maybe I allow a third party agent to do the deal for me. Either way, that's direct licensing. But there are a whole load of scenarios in the music industry where that's not what happens. Instead, the collective licensing system is utilized. And in collective licensing, all the artists and all the labels put all of their rights into one pot and appoint a single organisation to license on their behalf. And then all of the writers and publishers, they put all of their rights into one pot and appoint a central organisation to license on their behalf. And those organisations, well, we sometimes call them collecting societies or PROs, performing rights organisations. Generally in this webinar we'll call them CMOs, collective management organisations. Those organisations, in a whole load of scenarios, then license for everybody. They agree blanket licensing deals with users of music, they collect the money and they pass it back to the copyright owners based on usage. When collective licensing applies, varies from country to country. It's sometimes different for songs and recordings. But the physical recordings of songs, the live performance of songs, the public performance of recorded music, radio and TV are very often licensed through the collective licensing system. Certainly they are in the UK and in many other countries too. There are some exceptions, but that is very common. If you think about it, when physical recordings of songs are being licensed, live performance are being licensed, that's just the publishing rights. But with public performance of recorded music, radio and TV, both recording rights and publishing rights are being exploited. The music industry has set up different collecting societies in every country where it operates. And generally, there will be one collecting society for the publishing rights on the song side and a separate society for recordings on the recording side. Actually, there may be more separation than that. On the song side, there may be separate societies for the performing rights and the mechanical rights of the same songs. Meanwhile, on the recording side, sometimes you have one society working for labels and another society working for performers. In the UK, we have MCPS, representing the mechanical rights in songs, PRS representing the performing rights in songs. Actually in the UK, PPL represents both the artists and the labels. But what matters to us today isn't all of these scenarios. Our question today is, what about digital? Is digital licensed through direct deals, or is digital licensed through a collective licensing system? Hold that thought, we'll come back to that later. But now step 4. Streaming exploits both mechanical rights and performing rights at the same time. Now, if you go and read copyright law to find out which of the copyright controls we talked about earlier are exploited when music is streamed, generally copyright law doesn't say. Actually, most copyright law was written before streaming was even something we really talked about. But the music industry has decided that both mechanical rights and performing rights are being exploited whenever music is streamed. That's actually quite important, because if you think about it, when a CD is pressed, just the mechanical rights are being exploited. Okay, songs and recordings, they're being copied, they're being distributed, but that's all. Meanwhile, with old school radio, where a DJ went into a studio and played CDs and vinyl, and that was then broadcast to the local area, just the performing rights were being exploited, specifically the communication control. But as I say, the music industry has decided that when it comes to streaming, both the mechanical rights, the copying bit, and the performing rights, the communicating, making available bit, are being exploited. You might think that's mere semantics, but you will see in a bit why that's important. Okay, that's the copyright information, the licensing information out of the way. Let's get into digital licensing and the deals that are done. And let's start off with recordings. Generally speaking, on the recording side, direct deals are done. The collective licensing system is not employed. There are a handful of exceptions to that. Certain streaming services, which are almost like radio stations, but with some interactivity, might be licensed through the collecting societies. But a full on-demand service like Spotify is not. The record industry's collecting societies have not been empowered to license those services, which means as a streaming service, you need to go and do deals directly with the record companies and the music distributors. If it was a global service and you needed Anglo-American repertoire, you'd probably begin with the major record companies, Universal Music, Sony Music, and Warner Music, and seek to get the global catalogues of those 3 massive record companies. Now, all 3 of those companies also have distribution divisions, or what we might now call label services divisions, where they represent and distribute the recordings of other labels and sometimes single artist labels as well, artists who are in essence self-releasing. So Warner has ADA, Sony has The Orchard, Universal has Caroline, and also owns Ingroups. So when you're negotiating your deal with Universal, Sony and Warner, you would probably try to get the distributed labels, the catalogue that's represented by ADA with Warner, Orchard with Sony, certainly Caroline with Universal, included in those deals. After the majors, next, you go and talk to an organisation called Merlin. Merlin represents about half of the indie labels and distributors worldwide. And what Merlin does is negotiate a template deal for its members. Its members then see that deal and they can decide to opt in or not. Once you've done your deal with the majors and Merlin, you then access all the other music that's not covered by the majors and Merlin through the distributors. Some distributors predominantly work for labels. Some distributors predominantly work for artists. Some distributors are global, some focus on certain countries, some on certain genres. So you try and get deals with as many of the distributors as possible. You could try and do deals directly with artists, and if you think about it, SoundCloud and YouTube, because they have a user-generated content element to what they do allow artists to directly put their music into those services if the artist wants to. Spotify dabbled with the idea of having a direct upload tool, but ultimately decided against it. And most on-demand streaming services do not have direct relationships with artists. They would prefer, for various reasons, to work with labels and distributors. So, that's the recording side. But remember, those are only the recording rights. And the minute these deals have been done, all these labels and distributors start uploading music to the streaming services platform, and in that music, as well as the recordings covered by the label and distributor deals, are a whole load of songs, and the song rights need to be licensed separately. Which brings us to step 6. This is where it starts to get really complicated. When it comes to the song rights, sometimes the song rights are licensed through collecting societies, CMOs, other times through direct deals between streaming services and music publishers. But let's start off with the CMO deals. In many countries, the collecting society on the song side is able to provide a license to the streaming service. And actually, when you do deals with the societies like we have on this screen here, SACEM in France, STIM in Sweden, GAMER in Germany, etc., there's often two elements to that deal. So when you do your deal with SACEM in France, part of the deal is to access the French repertoire that is controlled by SACEM's members. And you might actually get permission in that deal to exploit that repertoire, not just in France, but in lots of countries, certainly the whole of the European Union and probably another 10-20 markets as well. But there will be a second element to the SACEM deal as well, which is what I call the mop-up element. And what you would say to SACEM is, okay, with this deal, we now have permission to use the SACEM French repertoire in lots of countries, but also what we need is a mop-up just for France, because it's inevitable that once record companies start uploading music to our streaming service, that there are going to be some songs in some of those recordings that are not covered by one of our other society or publisher deals. And so just for France, we need you, SACEM, to be the mop-up. And if we don't know who to pay the royalties to, we'll pay them to you. And you will try and work out who needs to be paid through your reciprocal agreements with all the other societies in the world. So in many cases, when the services do their deals with the societies, there's those two elements to the deal. Now, I've already said this. The music industry has set up separate collecting societies in every country. Sometimes there are different societies for mechanical rights and performing rights. In some countries, there are multiple societies representing just the performing rights. That's a lot of deals to be done. The music industry recognises that, and some collecting societies have started to collaborate on digital licensing through initiatives that we sometimes call copyright hubs or licensing hubs. So for example, SACEM's Armonia venture, and then the ICE venture set up by STIM, GAMER and PRS. And among the things that ICE does and what Armonia is primarily there to do is to allow a streaming service to access multiple society repertoires through one set of negotiations. It will ultimately be a STIM deal, a GAMER deal, a PRS deal, but it can all be negotiated through ICE. The same with Armonia. Lots of southern European societies come together for that. So that's what we do with the collecting societies. But remember, a stream exploits both the mechanical rights and the performing rights at the same time. And in some countries, especially the Anglo-American markets, there are separate societies, one for performing rights and one for mechanical rights. So for example, in Canada, SOCAM is just a performing rights organisation in Canada. They will bring you the performing rights but not the mechanical rights. So we need to do a separate deal with an organisation called CMRRA to get the mechanical rights for Canada. In essence, the same thing happens here in the UK in that we have PRS for performing rights and MCPS for mechanical rights, although the good news is they work together. So although technically you're negotiating two licenses, you will do so through one set of negotiations. What about America? On America, there are 4 societies representing the performing rights in songs. BMI and ASCAP are the big 2, CSAC and GMR are the small 2. But they're just performing rights. What about mechanical rights? Well, the bad news is there isn't a traditional mechanical rights collecting society like MCPS in the US. There are agencies that will help users of music exploit a compulsory license that exists for mechanical copying under American copyright law. However, those agencies like the Harry Fox Agency and MRI, they can administrate the licensing of mechanical rights, but they can't provide that mop-up that we get from other societies elsewhere in the world. That's created all sorts of problems for the licensing of streaming in America. But some good news. Because of those problems, there was a change to American copyright law, and as a result of that, a mechanical rights society like MCPS is now being established in the US for the first time. It will be called the MLC. It will hopefully be up and running by the end of the year. But crucially, the point here is, in some countries, we might have to do 2 collecting society deals, one for mechanical rights and one for performing rights. That's not true everywhere. In most of continental Europe, there's a single society representing both sets of rights. GAMER in Germany, SACEM in France. They will do both mechanical and performing rights in one deal. But in some countries, and especially the Anglo-American markets, you have to get both mechanical rights and performing rights done, and that may require doing 2 deals with different societies. Hey, time for another complication on the song side, because I said at the start of this section that in addition to CMO deals, some song rights are actually licensed through direct deals. It's mainly the Anglo-American repertoire of the bigger publishers, Sony, Universal, Warner, BMG, Cobalt. Although it has to be said, a lot of smaller publishers and independents are now also going this route. Some via a coalition called Impel, others in their own right. So as well as the collecting society deals, a streaming service has to do deals with publishers as well. But there's a complication to this complication, which is caused by the way that song rights are structured in the music industry. In Anglo-American markets, although the publishers control the mechanical rights in the songs of the songwriters they sign, they don't actually control the performing rights. The performing rights are controlled by collecting societies. This convention actually happens all over. In continental Europe, the CMOs actually generally have even more control over the songwriters' rights. But in Anglo-American markets like the UK and Ireland and Canada, the publisher controls the mechanical rights, but the CMOs control the performing rights. So when the publishers start doing direct deals, if they want to also offer performing rights as part of those deals, because the streaming services need the performing rights, then the publisher has to do a deal with all the Anglo-American CMOs in order to put the performing rights into the deal with the mechanical rights. Yeah, I said, another complication. So basically the publishers form a JV with one CMO and then via that relationship have access to the other Anglo-American CMOs to allow all of that to happen. To conclude, because it's complicated on the song side, basically if you're licensing a streaming service you need to do some direct deals with the publishers, particularly for Anglo-American repertoire, and then a lot of collecting society deals, making sure that you're getting both performing rights and mechanical rights covered. But what is the deal? Step number 7. The streaming deals are ultimately revenue share deals. The streaming services are committing to share a certain portion of their revenues, their subscription revenues, their advertising revenues every month with the music industry. Now, every deal is different. Every label deal, every distributor deal, every publisher deal, every collecting society deal, they're all different. And the rates in those deals, the actual specifics of the revenue share, are often a secret. However, we know that generally speaking, 50 to 60% of streaming service revenues are allocated to recordings, and then, oh, hang on, that went backwards, and then 10 to 15% is allocated to the publisher. These revenue share agreements have changed over the last 10 years because the deals between the streaming services and the music industry tend to come up every 2 to 3 years. And what has happened over the last 10 years is that the labels have seen their revenue share go down from the upper end of that bracket to the lower end of that bracket. Meanwhile, the publishers have managed to get their share up. Nevertheless, it has to be said that across the board, the recording is still getting the biggest cut of digital revenue. The song then gets a relatively small cut. There's a service, DSP means digital service provider, so that would be Spotify, Apple Music, whoever, is aiming to keep about 30% of the money. So it's a revenue share arrangement, but crucially, step 8, it's revenue share based on consumption share. What do I mean by that? Another little bit of complexity for you here. This is what happens every month. Spotify says, okay, how much money did we make in the UK last month by selling subscriptions? Let's say it's £10 million. Okay, right, we know what the money is like. Now, of all the music we streamed, what percentage was Universal Music owned or controlled recordings? Let's say it's 20%. Of all the streams that were streamed, 20% of those recordings are owned or controlled by Universal Music. So what we now do is we take our revenue and we allocate 20% of it to Universal Music. So if we began with 10 million, that would be 2 million. And then we have a revenue share deal with that record company. Let's say it's 50-50 for easy maths. Obviously Universal will be on slightly more than that, but let's say 50-50. So of the 20% of the money we allocated to Universal, we pay half of it to Universal Music. It'd be £1 million. Spotify does the maths for Universal, for Sony, for Warner, for Merlin, for all the distributors. That's just the recording rights. It then has to repeat the process for the song rights too. The aim being at the end of all of that, about 30% of the money is left on the table. Although we should note that there are some other elements to these deals as well. Revenue share is at the core of the deal, but there may also be some minimum guarantees. The streaming service may say to the record company, the publisher, the distributor, the society, we will guarantee you a certain amount of money per month or per subscriber or per play particularly in the early deals. There are also often advances where the streaming service advances money to the music company, and with new deals, especially with startup streaming services, the bigger labels will also push to get equity in those companies and to pass on any costs they incur, legal costs, admin costs, IT costs, to the streaming service. Step 10. Once all these deals have been done, the record companies, the distributors, start providing content to the streaming platform. And that content, that music, starts to be streamed. And then basically what happens is, every month, the streaming service assumes that whoever uploaded the content must control the recording rights. So therefore, we know who we need to pay. Okay, we know what music is controlled by Universal. Therefore, we can work out what percentage of consumption was Universal Music, so we can work out what allocation they are due, we can work out how much money we owe them, and then we send them the money and a spreadsheet of all of the tracks that were streamed, and they can work out how to pay their artists. But what about the song rights? Because we don't know what songs are contained in those recordings. The publishers do deals, the societies do deals, but they don't actually provide any content. So what happens every month is that the streaming services send to their licensing partners on the song site, the publishers, the societies, a spreadsheet of every track that has been streamed, identified by the ISRC, the unique identifier for the recordings. And they basically say to the publisher or the society, you work it out. So you go down that list of recordings by ISRC and work out which ones contain songs that you control. It's a major task, this matching of recordings to songs. What we actually mean is matching the ISRC that uniquely identifies the recording to the ISWC that uniquely identifies the song. That's a major task for the publishers and for the collecting societies, the CMOs, that they have to do every month, so that they can say to the DSP, we accounted for this percentage of consumption and therefore we're due this amount of money. Many publishers and societies actually outsource that work, and we've started to see a number of entities become experts at this matching of ISRC to ISWC. Some collecting societies have built their own teams, and then they allow other societies to access that team. And then we have agencies like ICE, which I mentioned earlier. Another service it offers is this matching. You've got NMP, Back Office Mint, and in America, HFA, MRI, all doing this matching service because of this extra complexity that the streaming service doesn't actually know what songs it's streaming, so the publishers and the societies have to tell it. And that concludes our 10-step guide to how digital services are licensed. But before we finish, we should just acknowledge that although the streaming business model of the Spotify variety has been around for over 10 years now, it does continue to evolve as the streaming market matures. Plus, there remain a number of challenges for the streaming music business, both for the services, but also for the music industry that benefits from those services. And there are some big debates within the music community, and specifically the artist community and the songwriter community, about the way that the streaming business model was constructed. It's certainly true to say that with the shift from selling physical discs to digital, and then within digital from downloads to streams, and this fundamentally new business model that the record industry is now operating to, there have been winners and there have been losers. And the question is, do we just accept that as a harsh reality of life, or do we ask whether or not the current model isn't completely fair, and as a result of that, those stakeholders who are negatively impacted, well, the fact they're negatively impacted is a problem for the wider music community. CMU has been working with the Music Managers Forum for a few years now on a project called the Dissecting the Digital Dollar Project, and in that program we've debated a lot of these issues. Now, we have separate webinars on the challenges and the debates, which you should check out if you're interested. But just to give you an idea of some of the challenges and discussions that are ongoing, there's the whole debate around price point, whether or not charging £10 a month for access to 50 million plus tracks, which has been the price point since Spotify launched in the late 2000s, whether it's time to increase that price. Bearing in mind it's a revenue share business for the music industry, so if the subscription rates go up, then the income should go up for the music industry too. Is it time to go to £11, £12? And if so, what are the challenges around that? Why has Spotify in the main been resisting that? Then you have the issue that many of the streaming platforms are yet to be properly profitable. Clearly that's not sustainable long term. What do we do about that? Then when the money comes in, that 70% approximately of revenue that comes into the music industry, is it shared out in the right way, in the fair way? So we saw, didn't we, how significantly more of the money goes to the recording, the record industry, than to the song, the songwriters and the publishers. Is that split the right split? In terms of how the recording money gets shared between the label and the artist, well, that depends on each artist's record deal. But some artists would argue that their royalty share on streaming should be higher than it currently is. But what do we do about that, given that every record deal is different? And there's the whole debate around user-centric royalty distribution, which is a different way of working out consumption splits on a monthly basis. I won't go into that now, but we do have a separate webinar all about that. And if you are interested, it's Deezer who are really pushing the user-centric model, and they have a whole website where they explain what it means. Then there's things about the complexities in the way the money flows from the streaming services through labels and distributors on the recording side and through publishers and societies on the song side to the artists and songwriters. And where there are inefficiencies in those royalty chains, money can get delayed, but it can also get lost. And those issues are much bigger on the song side of the business than they are on the recording side of the business for various reasons. Then you have things like the advances and the equity and the fees that the labels often demand, particularly the majors when they're doing their streaming deals. Do the artists and the distributed labels then get to share in those extra benefits of the deal? There's lots of issues around transparency. The deals that have been done between the music industry and the streaming services are usually secret. They are NDA'd. Even if you're a superstar artist signed to one of the majors, it's unlikely that you as the artist or your management and team and accountant will get to see that deal. And it has felt that the lack of transparency in streaming has been an issue. There have been a handful of improvements on that side, although it has to be said, issues remain, and as each new kind of deal is done, so the Facebook deal, the TikTok deal, a whole load of new questions are thrown up for artists and managers and their accountants, and often there isn't much transparency on those new kinds of arrangements. There's the whole safe harbor debate and the so-called opt-out streaming services, the user upload platforms like YouTube and Facebook and SoundCloud. Again, we won't go into that today. We have a separate webinar on that, but that's an ongoing debate despite the European Copyright Directive last year potentially helping the music industry to an extent. All the issues around copyright data, and if we have bad copyright data, it stops people getting paid. And finally, simply the challenge of adapting to a totally new way of doing business. Whereas with discs and downloads, it was all about first week sales, hype around launch, selling as many records as you can in the first couple of months. Whereas with streaming, the launch is important, but even if you have a super successful launch around a new record, it's about repeat listening, getting people to listen to the music again and again and again. Some of the ongoing challenges and debates around the streaming business. As I say, we have separate webinars that delve into some of those issues which you might want to check out. Plus, we have a book, the Dissecting Digital Dollar book, that the MMF has published, which summarises all the work that the MMF and CMU have done together on this area, and many of these issues are explained and discussed in more detail there as well. But that brings to an end our main presentation today, explaining the inner workings of the streaming business. So I think what we should do now is move on to answering some of your questions. Okay, yes, we've had lots of questions coming in as the presentation has been going. Oh, look at that. It looks like the slides are reloading. So I'm going to ask my colleague Sam if he can... there we go. Look at that. Tell you what. I'll turn my video back on. I'm still here. Hello, everybody. Yes, lots of great questions coming in. So I've been stacking them all up on my computer. So let me just go through them now in turn. First of all, we had one question about my use of the term neighbouring rights. And it's from someone outside of the UK. And you're right to be confused. The term neighbouring rights is confusing. The record industry today, certainly here in the UK, tends to use the word neighbouring rights to mean performing rights, as I said earlier, so the performance and communication controls combined. But the term neighbouring rights has at least 3 different definitions around the world. So In some countries, the term neighbouring rights is used to mean the recording rights in their totality. So under French copyright law, we talk about there being author rights, that would be the song copyright, and neighbouring rights, or sometimes we might call them related rights, which is the recording copyright. So the term neighbouring rights is confusing. The person who was confused is right to be confused. It's confusing. What I always say is whenever anybody talks about neighbouring rights, you need to be very specific about what it is they're talking about. In the UK, if they're in the record industry, they're almost certainly talking about what publishers would call the performing rights, the performance and communication controls combined. So that's a little copyright point out of the way there. Getting into streaming now, one person asked another good question. At what duration of a song or track streaming is it counted as a play for a royalty? In the main, for most services, certainly Spotify, it's 30 seconds. So basically, if they skip before 30 seconds, it's not counted as a play. So you would not get a royalty. If it goes beyond 30 seconds, even if it's a 2-hour piece of classical music, you would still only count as one play. So that's another example of a system that is good for some people and not for others. It skews towards people that make shorter tracks. Maybe there should be a different system for that, particularly in the classical space. But for most, certainly Spotify, at 30 seconds, the play is counted and the royalty will be paid. Somebody asked some questions about the revenue share arrangement, the sort of the 50 to 60% going to the recording. And yes, that then gets shared out between the label and the artist, or if it's a distribution arrangement, the distributor and the artist. So it's up to 60%. And actually, to be honest with you, these days on the Spotify deals, it's more likely to be 54, 55% being allocated to the recordings. That then gets shared out between the label and the artist. So what the artist receives will depend on the artist deal. So if they are on a 50-50 rev share deal, they would get 50% of the 55%. If they were using a sort of TuneCore type distributor to get their music out there, TuneCore pass on 100% of the money. If they're on a classic record deal with a major record company, or if we're being honest, many of the bigger indies as well, they would be getting a minority of the money. A lot of labels these days do pay a slightly higher royalty on a stream versus a CD, but usually looking at about 20%. So that's 20% of the 55% is how much is going to the artist. But it is totally dependent on the artist's record deal. And that's a conversation ongoing in the artist community. Some people think that there should be some standards about what cut of the money goes to artists, particularly heritage artists. There are heritage artists who signed their record deals all the way back in the 60s and 70s when record deals were terrible for artists. And they're still on a 4 or 5% royalty even now on streaming. And those artists would say that's not fair. The question is, can copyright law interfere in record contracts that were agreed openly by artists and record companies? Now, actually, last year's copyright directive in the European Union includes a thing called the contract adjustment mechanism. We're not quite sure how it's going to work. It comes from the movie industry and German copyright law, but its potential probably not in the UK, certainly not in the US, neither of which are in the European Union, UK not anymore either. But I mean, the idea of a contract adjustment mechanism doesn't seem right in the context of UK law and US law, although I should stress the artists here will probably push for it. But in some other places in continental Europe, it seems more like something that copyright law should do. At the moment, it doesn't really, but maybe it might in the future. So that's the difference between I've just seen a really good question come in. That's the difference between how much of the money the artist gets. It's totally dependent at the moment on the record contract. One person has just asked whether the record industry's collecting societies, so here in the UK that's PPL, gets involved in any of this. In the main, no. You're saying, well, hang on a second, I've said that a stream exploits the communication element of the copyright. PPL represents the communication of the element of the copyright. What's going on there? It's because there are two kinds of communication. There's true communication, and then there's a subset of communication which is referred to as the making available right, which was added into copyright law in the 1990s. Some people see it as a seventh control, which would ruin my nice slide, wouldn't it? Because I'd have a seventh box. But in UK copyright law, it is explicitly stated that making available is a subset of communication. So what the record companies would argue is, yes, there is some communication going on in a stream, but it's a making available communication, not a traditional communication, and that's why PPL don't get involved. So in the main, PPL and their equivalents around the world do not get involved, except with some services that are more like radio. So for example, in the US, we have Pandora and iHeartRadio, personalized radio services with limited functionality. They actually could license through the collective licensing system, through Sound Exchange. But actually they don't anymore. They did their direct deals. But if they fell out with the record companies, they could actually go to Sound Exchange and do it through the collective licensing system. Okay, what else have we got? Somebody got a little bit confused by the total consumption point. The consumption share based, no, hang on, the other way around. Revenue share based on consumption share. So it is quite confusing. I don't know whether that was my description of it or whether it is just quite confusing. But basically, I'll just say it again. What happens is every month, let's say there's £10 million come in from selling subscriptions for Spotify here in the UK. So there's £10 million on the table. What Spotify says to Universal is, okay, we've got £10 million. Of all the streams that were streamed in the UK last month, 20% was of Universal recordings. So we're going to allocate 20% of the money to Universal. So that would be 2 million. But that's the allocation. It's not the payment, it's the allocation to Universal's catalogue. The allocation is then shared with the record company based on the deal. And the deal will say Universal gets 55% of that money. So then 55% of Universal's allocation goes to Universal, Spotify keeps the rest, and then repeats the process for Sony and Warner and Merlin and the distributors and then all the publishers. The hope being that once all of that maths has been done, there is about 30% of the money left on the table, which actually brings to another question that's been asked, which relates to the per play rates. Recently, a little rate card did the rounds on social media. It happens about twice a year, every year, which sets out the per play rates for all the streaming services. And it will tell you that Apple pays double Spotify. The thing to caution about that price list that does the rounds on the internet is well, first of all, there are no per play rates. I've told you, it's revenue share based on consumption share. Yes, we can say, well, last month we had 10 million streams and we got paid this much money. And we can do some maths and we can work out a per play rate. But there isn't actually a per play rate. And so what you earn per play will differ certainly from country to country. Also month to month. One month the per play rate may be higher than the next month because actually the per play rates are irrelevant. What matters is revenue share based on consumption share. And one of the key reasons why that price list that does the rounds on social media is misleading is that with a service like Spotify, all the maths I talked about earlier is done once for premium, but then it's done separately for free, and it's done separately for the student discount, and it's done separately for the family plan, and it's done separately for the mobile phone bundle. They're all, the maths is done separately. Because there's a lot more subscription money than there is advertising money, it means that the per play rates on a free stream will always be a fraction of the per play rates on a paid for stream. When you see a single Spotify per play rate, that means that somebody has averaged it out. They've taken all of the different rates and they've averaged it. We call it a blended rate. And that's very misleading because Apple doesn't have a free service. Actually, a Spotify premium stream will be paying pretty much the same as an Apple premium stream in any one country in any one month. Actually, probably Apple is paying slightly more for various reasons. But then there's much more parity than that rate card suggests. So be wary of that rate card. It's a decent approximation, okay, but all the different services within each streaming service have been blended. Be wary of that. And also remember that it all varies month to month, country to country, and technically there are no per play rates. We've had a few questions about the YouTube deal, the Facebook deal, the TikTok deal. If you thought it was confusing already, the minute we get into those user upload platforms, it's even more confusing. Also, it differs. So think about YouTube. Obviously, YouTube has a streaming service, the subscription service, YouTube Music, which is licensed in exactly the same way as everything I've talked about today. With the user upload platform, so the main YouTube platform, things work a little bit differently. And the same is true for Facebook and the same is true for TikTok. It is ultimately revenue share. The artist is sharing in any advertising revenue that is being generated. Quite how that works varies. Sometimes, for example, on YouTube, it's directly a share of any advertising that plays alongside the content. On Facebook, if an ad plays in the middle of the video in the annoying way that it does, you get a cut of that ad income. As for the TikTok deals, I'll be honest with you, I don't yet know. And I think one of the challenges for the Music Managers Forum is that with the Spotify deals and then the Apple Music deal and the Deezer deal, etc., they're all a similar model. It took several years of me working with MMF and talking to managers and lawyers and labels and distributors to work out how it works, because the managers were not involved in those conversations way back when the deals were negotiated in the late 2000s. And we basically worked it out. And then Sony's Spotify deal leaked, and we got to see the contract and confirm that it was all right. But then Facebook comes along, and TikTok comes along. And because those are different services, they're also different deals. And immediately, from a manager's perspective, then it's a learning curve again. How does the TikTok deal work? And we're still learning, because those deals are very new. In fact, not everybody even has a TikTok deal yet. So at the moment, we don't know, but we are working on it, and we're trying to find it out. And when we know, we'll produce a guide that explains it. I suppose the other quick thing to say is, obviously, if your music's being used in somebody else's video, a user-generated video, and that's going to be a big growth area for streaming music in the years ahead. The audio ID software that YouTube has developed, Facebook has developed, TikTok are developing, tries to identify the recording so that the recording can be reported, the money can be paid. Does that work? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And then that recording data is handed over to the collecting societies and the publishers, and they try and work out what songs are in there. Extra complexities, which can result in inefficiencies, which can result in money not getting through. We are almost out of time. So I'm just going to see if there's one last question that I can. How are royalty arrangements relating specifically to streaming usually specified in an artist record deal? Okay, that's an interesting question. Let's finish with that. And then, as I say, we're going to do our Q&A reports for all of these webinars. So if I haven't answered your question today, I apologize. We've got so many people logged in today. That's very exciting. We haven't had a chance to answer all of them, but we are storing them, and we will do these Q&A reports. We're working on those as we speak. We'll get them out as soon as we can. But somebody is asking, okay, what would it say in the record contract with regards to the streaming payment? Now, a new record contract really ought to specifically say the rate on a stream is X. So you know, the deal will say when we sell a CD, you get this royalty. Maybe that's 15%. Major label deal. On a download, you get 17%. On a stream, you get 20. Whatever, and it should be explicitly stated in the deal. For pre-streaming deals and pre-digital deals, that has been a challenge, because if the record contract doesn't mention streams, what do we do? And there have been a number of legal disputes over that, mainly in the US, because old school record contracts often made a distinction between a sale and a license. And really what that meant from the record label's perspective was a sale was a CD, a vinyl record, a cassette, and a license was things like sync. And often on a traditional record contract, you would get 15% or even less on a sale and 50%, 50-50 split on a sync, on a license. Now, obviously, the record industry's deals with Spotify, licensing deals. So some artists have said, hang on a second, this is a license, so we should get our 50%. There was a big test case involving the Bass Brothers who worked on the early Eminem records, and actually they won and got a higher cut. But it has to be said that when it comes to pre-digital contracts that don't mention streaming, it is a little bit of a debate. What royalty should be paid? And if as an artist you think the label is paying you too low a royalty and the contract doesn't actually say what the royalty should be, well, the question is, are you willing to sue on that? And there has been a lot of debate about that in the artist community. A new record contract really should explicitly set out all the different revenue streams. The problem with a new record contract is the next revenue stream we haven't thought of yet. The thing that becomes the next big thing in 3 years' time that isn't going into new record contracts today. Anyway, look at that. We are out of time. Thank you so much for tuning in to this latest CMU Insights Lockdown webinar. We have one more to go this week. Tomorrow, back to marketing and the marketing toolkit tomorrow. And then a whole load more coming up next week and the week after. As always, you can download the slides. They're already on the website at the link we sent you earlier. If you don't know what link I'm talking about, do not worry. We're going to send you another email later today, which will have that link and also tell you how you can access the recording of this on demand. And of course, don't forget, we are working on those Q&A reports. They're taking a little bit longer than we'd hoped, but we will start pushing those out. So if you've been on past webinars, start looking out for emails coming from us very soon saying, here's the PDF of the Q&A report to download. Thanks very much for tuning in. I hope you found it beneficial today. For those of you on the full program or who've already booked into tomorrow, see you tomorrow at 2:30 or maybe If you're not booked in, you want to be booked in. If you want to have a bit more marketing stuff, join us tomorrow at 2:30. That's it from this CMU Insights webinar. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and I'll see you tomorrow.